What do you make of the effort by many, and I did this as well before I became a Christian, in the name of coexisting, of saying, okay, I believe in evolution, but God made it, or God created this process, so that way we can all get along together. Right? What do you make of that attempt?
Well, we've produced a very big book about this concept called theistic evolution, with contributions from scientists, philosophers, and theologians. It's called Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. The basic meaning of the problem starts with the different meanings of evolution. Evolution can simply mean change over time, and if your idea is that God has caused change over time, well, there's nothing incoherent about that. But evolution can also mean that there's been a completely undirected, unguided process that has produced everything that has changed over time, all the different forms of life on Earth. And reconciling that with any meaningful form of theism, let alone a specifically biblical form or biblical Christianity, is very difficult, because it's logically incoherent to say that God has guided an unguided process, that God has guided a process that is undirected. And yet Darwinian evolution denies that there is real design in nature. It claims that that organisms exhibit the appearance of design, but there's no actual design, because there was an unguided, undirected natural process that produced that appearance. And so Darwinian evolution is committed to the idea of an unguided, undirected form of change over time. And that's inconsistent with the idea that God did something to cause different forms of life to arise. And so that's where the tension is. It's essentially logical. In addition, the Darwinian mechanism of mutation and selection is increasingly questioned by leading even evolutionary biologists. I attended a conference in 2016 at the Royal Society in London, convened by a group of leading evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard textbook theory of evolution, because they doubt that the mutation natural selection mechanism has genuine creative power. It does a good job of explaining small-scale variations, how finch beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns, or how the famous peppered moths in England change their coloration in response to variations in air quality. But it does a poor job of explaining the origin of birds or insects or mammals or animals in general in the first place. That these major innovations in the history of life are not well explained at all by small-scale random variations in the genome. And so leading evolutionary biologists are questioning the creative power of Darwinian evolution. And I think it's very ironic, therefore, that you have leading Christians, often biologists in Christian colleges or groups like BioLogos, claiming that the mutation selection mechanism is the means by which God created. If it's not a creative process, then why attribute God's creativity to it?
Oh, how amazing that even evolutionary biologists are starting to questioning and abandoning, perhaps, as Christians are joining in. Wild. And that was
this is actually a very significant trend in the field. There's a whole group of evolutionary biologists who term themselves third way, and they don't accept intelligent design, which is the view that I and my colleagues are advancing. But they are very critical of neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we all learn. They don't really have an adequate alternative yet. And I discuss this at length in my second book, Darwin's Doubt, for people who might be interested in exploring that issue more.
There's two things that made me question evolution more than anything. That one we were just talking about, that even they're questioning it. And the second thing was that Darwin's Origin of Species never even attempts to explain the origin of species. Is that the most talked about book that is like the least read book? The Origin of Species doesn't even try. What do people today, what do these evolutionary biologists today, what's their best stab at where life first came from?
Well, I think what you're referring to is that Darwin's Origin of Species didn't attempt or address the ultimate question of the origin of the first life. How do you get from simple non-living chemicals in a prebiotic environment, in what Darwin imagined, he called it a warm little pond, and other scientists have called the prebiotic soup. How do you get from those chemicals to an actual living cell? And in Darwin's time, this was thought to be a fairly simple problem, because they had a very simplistic understanding of what constitutes the living cell, that constitutes the smallest unit of living of living stuff. One of Darwin's colleagues described the cell as a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. Well, that was the 1860s, 1870s view. But post Watson and Crick in the 1950s and 60s, biologists now know that inside the living cell, we have a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system. DNA literally contains digital code, and that digital code directs the construction of proteins, which in turn process information on the DNA and also perform all the other important jobs in the cell. It's something like an automated factory. And in addition to all that, we've discovered little tiny nanomachines, rotary engines, sliding clamps, little turbines, little robotic walking motor proteins that tow vesicles of materials from one part of the cell to another where they're needed for various processes. This is anything but undifferentiated protoplasm. And as our view of the complexity of the cell has advanced, it's forced a complete revision of our understanding of the origin of life. It's not plausible to think that a few simple chemical reactions would have produced the intricacy of design that we see at this foundational level. And moreover, we know from experience the digital code, which is what DNA stores, always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a section of software or hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book. Information in a digital form, and again, that's what we found at the foundation of life, always arises from a mind, not an undirected material process. So I've argued I'm sorry to mention all the books I've done, but the first one is called Signature in the Cell, and it was precisely about this question of origin of the first life, how it's presented a mystery to evolutionary theorists, but it does seem to, but the cell presents evidence which is best explained by the action of a designing intelligence, that being based on our uniform and repeated experience of cause and effect. Again, we always, whenever we see information and trace it back to its source, we always find a mind, an intelligence, not an undirected material process.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, our newest special is on the book of Genesis. Why? Because things are really screwed up in this country and we got to get back down to basics. And what better place to start than in the beginning? This Saturday, 9 o'clock Eastern, right here on The